Hey guys, before we get started, be sure to go check out BrillArmory for all your airsoft upgrade parts and more. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Inside the Gearbox. Today on Inside the Gearbox, we will be going over how to install a single signal wire 3034 based MOSFET, particularly the NukeFET, into a standard M4 AEG. Warning, do all the following at your own risk. I am not responsible for any modifications you make to your airsoft gun, good or bad. In addition, this video will contain no more than the necessary information and processes required to install a MOSFET, Dean's connectors, and motor connectors to your AEG. If you desire more information on the subject, it will not be found here. Before we get started, let's go over some tools and parts you will need to install this MOSFET. For tools, you will need a soldering iron, some solder, wire strippers, a pair of pliers, helping hands, or even a hobby vise. Since we will be totally rewiring a gun to a MOSFET, 16 gauge wire, new motor connectors, and Deans, you will need all these parts to complete the exact process I will be performing. However, if you're just installing a MOSFET, follow the instructions required to install the MOSFET. First, plug in your soldering iron so that it's warming up while you take down your gun. This will save you time. Now that your gun is taken down and your gearbox is disassembled, remove the trigger contacts and wire along with them. Now that we have removed the trigger contacts from our gearbox, disassemble them to where you just have the contacts. Trigger contact housings have screws in them to hold plates down that in turn hold the contacts themselves in place. Remove the screws, plates, and then the contacts. Once you have disassembled your contact housing, remove the old stock wires from the contacts like so. This is my least favorite part. Compare your stock wire lengths and placement with your new MOSFET and 16 gauge wire. Decide where you want your MOSFET to sit and cut the wire to your desired length. I have decided to have mine sit in the buffer tube about midway through. After you have cut your wires down to your desired length, use a pair of wire strippers to strip each end of your wires. Strip about 5 millimeters or so of wire insulation off each end. Once you have stripped the end of each wire, tin each end like so. In addition, don't forget to tin each contact like so. There may be solder on it from the factory where it's out of the gearbox, but sometimes it's not of the greatest quality. Now that all of our wires and contacts are tinned, take your two positive wires, the ones that are not connected to the MOSFET, mine are green, and solder them to the contact that sits lower in the housing. We solder them onto the lowest contact because it won't interfere with the safety bar or trigger. Be sure to take your time with this and make it look as neat as possible. No need to rush. Next, take your signal wire and solder it to the contact, the other one of course. Notice how the positive wires and signal wire do not touch each other on the exposed wire strands or solder joints. Be sure to replicate this or your MOSFET will short out and break. Then, take your motor connectors and tin them like so and solder the wires to them. Do the exact same thing to the other wire. Make sure it's neat. After installing your motor connectors, be sure to install some heat shrink so they don't short out your MOSFET. Finally, we have our MOSFET installed into our gearbox. However, before we close it up, let's do some checking real quick. First, look at the safety bar and trigger. Make sure they have room to move back and forth over the wire, like so. Number 2, make sure your signal wire and positive wire are pushed down as far as possible over the area where the motor shaft comes up. Right here. If you don't, they will be torn up by the motor shaft or pinion gear. That is if they are risen up too much and not pushed down enough. To remedy this, what you can do is you can push the signal wire out and the positive wire underneath of it. This effectively causes them to rest in a single plane, not on top of each other. Number 3, make sure your gearbox will close up with your new wires. Sometimes the gearbox pegs that hold the wires down are too protruding and won't allow your gearbox to close. If so, just dremel the pegs away. They do more harm than good in this case. Other than that, you're good to go, but we're not quite done yet. We still got to install the DINs. Now, before you grab the DIN connector, put some heat shrink on your wires. Then, take your DIN connector and tin it . Now take the wire and solder it to the correct leads. Be sure to solder the positive wire to the positive tab of the DIN and the negative wire to the negative tab of the DIN. Now that we finally have our MOSFET installed and our gun is nearly put back together, we can test it to see if it works. I got my 11 volt hooked up. We're going to see how it works. Safety works. Semi. Works fine. Full auto. Switch back to semi. Works fine. Safety. Works fine. Congratulations, you have successfully installed a 3034 MOSFET into your AEG. That does it for this episode of Inside the Gearbox. I will see you guys later.